Time now for our Entre Nous segment, and today we're discussing bicycling and how safe or not safe the French capital is when it comes to cycling. France 24 Solange Moujat joins me. Solange, great to see you. You're one of the thousands of Parisians who like to get around the city on a bicycle, and I'm one of the few that don't.
Yes, you frequently call me crazy. Fun disclaimer here, we often discuss this in the newsroom, and we regularly discuss how many Parisians and how Paris has been transformed over the past few years to become a bike-friendly place. That is the fun part. But there is a sad and tragic element here too, which is part of why we're talking about this. Over the past 2 weeks, there has been a lot of discussion about road rage and cycling in France, specifically in cities like Paris, because on October 15th at 5:45 p.m., a cyclist was killed in central Paris. He was 27 years old. His name was Paul Vary, and he was run over by an SUV. Witnesses at the scene say that a driver was going down the bike lane, ran over Vary's foot, they got into an argument, and then video footage shows that the SUV driver ran over him and killed him. The 54-year-old says that it was not deliberate, but those at the scene say that that's not true, and the driver has been formally charged with culpable homicide and is behind bars. Now, that accident 2 weeks ago has opened the floodgates of sort of testimonies by other cyclists over road rage and a sense of real vulnerability that many say they feel in the capital when cycling, as these activists explain.
Sometimes you encounter people who are dangerous and strange. There are a lot of fights.
I have been insulted for no reason. You can sense people are annoyed.
A murder like this one is rare, but the violence that cyclists live through today is not. All cyclists have experienced it, be it threats, intimidation, being put in danger, or purposeful collisions. Every cyclist has stories like these.
Now, tributes to the killed cyclists have been held in multiple cities across France. There were moments of silence, an outpouring of grief, and a lot of calls for change, not only in regard to safety, but also in regard to road rage. The Deputy Transportation Minister met with a number of cycling associations on Monday and announced those figures I will talk to you about in a moment. The Deputy Transportation Minister announced that they are creating a commission on road violence. It will last for 4 months and focus on how to reduce anger and violence in Paris's streets in France between drivers, be they in a car, a bicycle, or on mopeds.
Solange, some of the car drivers say that cyclists are to blame for these altercations. Why do they get such a bad rap?
Well, they do really have a bad reputation, especially among car drivers and pedestrians in Paris. Now, many car drivers say that cyclists do not follow the rules of the road. And in many cases, this is true. Yeah. It's also true for cars at times. In my view, there are dangerous drivers, des chauffards, as we call them in French, both in cars and on bicycles. But if we go beyond that, cyclist associations put forth a number of arguments against this bad reputation of les vélos or bikes in France. First, they argue that many of the road rules are not designed for cars and don't always put safety of the cyclists into account in those rules. Namely, for example, it's a perfect example, you're at a stoplight when a car or a truck is turning right. There is the argument that that is dangerous and therefore you should move ahead. Then there's the argument that much of this tension comes from the fact that we are in an era of transition where cars are being given less space in cities, and that creates frustration among those stuck in traffic. There's also the fact that not enough car drivers have been educated about cycling's dangers. There's a push, for example, for drivers to learn cycling rules when they get their car licenses. Things like opening your car door with the opposite hand to avoid cyclists going over your car's door. There's also more of a push for cyclists for their complaints to the police to be taken seriously, and for drivers to potentially feel that they cannot get away with verbal and possibly physical violence.
These cases of violence are often turned into charges of involuntary injury because the courts can't find proof of the driver wanting to cause deliberate harm.
This road rage kills. When we suffer from it, in cases where we have not been physically injured, complaints aren't really possible. Even if we do file a complaint, the police do not accept it, or they lead to nothing. This impunity makes road violence more common.
Now, there's also the argument of vulnerability, of wait a minute, who's getting killed here? And it is the cyclists, not the drivers of the cars, that are in the fragile spot. So these cyclist associations say that the onus of responsibility needs to take into account this in this transition period where many drivers and cyclists are butting heads. It needs to take into account this aspect of vulnerability.
And also when it comes to the pedestrians
Also,
are the fragile spot. Solange, let's talk about how dangerous it really is to cycle around the capital.
Well, interestingly enough, it is not. It is a lot safer to drive, to bicycle actually, in Paris than it is to, say, on a country road. Cars in cities go slower. They're getting used to having so many cyclists commuting everywhere, even if it is creating tensions at times, at least. There's also a proven concept of safety in numbers. Studies have shown that in nations like the United States, it is more dangerous to be a cyclist because car drivers aren't used to them, or because there isn't enough proper infrastructure than, say, in Holland, where car drivers are used to sharing the road with bicycles. Now, as for the numbers of deaths, it is far less than car accident deaths per year. This makes sense. Cyclists account for only 4% of trips. There is a good government push to increase that percentage and a lot of funding to help that happen. But in regard to fatalities, in 2023, government figures showed that there were 3,107 deaths on French roads. Of those deaths, 226 were cyclists. Now, that's a drop of -8% from the previous year. So, indeed, cities like Paris, well, they are becoming safer to bicycling.
So who has the right of way?
It depends on the situation, rules of the road.
Solange, thank you very much for that. Solange Moujant there with our Entre Nous segment.